have you all here with us today. So my name is Sky Blue, and yes, that is my real name, and yes, my parents were hippies. And I have been deeply embedded in the intentional communities movement for 25 plus years at this point, having lived in a lot of different intentional communities and also working in various capacities as a networker, activist, organizer, and consultant. And I have a website, which is www.incommunity.us, which I'll drop in the chat real quick. And so you can find out more about me there. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. Okay. So, cooperative governance for intentional communities and beyond. So, I want to start off by saying that this is a really complex and multifaceted topic. I'm going to try and pack a lot into 90 minutes and make some time for questions as well. But there's only so much detail I can get into in 90 minutes. So to some extent, this is going to be more of an overview of all of the kinds of things that a group needs to consider when it comes to cooperative governance and creating a governance system. You will get the recording of this, and I will make notes and slides available. You'll get links to that as well, so you can go back and review things. So don't worry about it being kind of too dense. It might be a little too dense, but we'll see how it goes. I've also, on that note, I've also talked with Lauren, who runs FIC's online programs, about the possibility of turning this into a full course, so a multi-session course that people could go through. So if that is something that you're interested in, you can certainly reach out to me and let me know, or you can reach out to Lauren at ic.org, and let her know, or I think you'll get a feedback form with this workshop too that you can certainly fill out and say that you'd like more, and maybe that'll happen. No commitment, just wanting to get a sense about whether there would be enough people who might take a longer course on this if that were made available. All right, so diving in. So the first place I want to start is on reconceptualizing governance. And also just to say too that that the focus of this presentation is on intentional communities, but this is also coming out of my experience with all kinds of cooperative organizations, cooperative businesses, nonprofits, coalitions of organizations. And so it's really is applicable to any kind of group of people coming together to fulfill a purpose in a collaborative way. So as we start to look at cooperative governance and a reconceptualizing of governance, I want to read you from the foundational documents of a very famous intentional community. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Also, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among humans, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government should become destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Sort of lastly, along these lines, there's of course this sort of famous quote, "Of the people, by the people, for the people," from Abraham Lincoln. So yes, so I'm being a little cute here, but I do think that thinking of a whole country, or on smaller scales, states or cities, as intentional communities is useful in terms of thinking about how do we be intentional about the different forms of human organization that we engage in. And also, I think the sort of the thought experiment of the U.S. as a intentional community, or any country as an intentional community, is that the Constitution, to some extent, did establish the pattern for formal legal organization in this country. So, you look at intentional communities, and you usually have some kind of a foundational document, bylaws, operating agreement, vision and mission statements, these sorts of things that lays out the values, the purpose, and how decisions are made. So the idea here being is that rather than just letting things evolve as they will, or at the whim of a single ruler, there is an established intent to develop things in a particular way for particular reasons, and to do so in a way that is based on the consent of those involved. So I want to pause here for a moment to acknowledge that it is pretty well known that there was strong influence on the formation of the U.S. Constitution and American democracy, particularly by the Iroquois Confederacy. There's a couple articles that get into this that I'll share in the notes. But I want to do sort of the governance equivalent of a land acknowledgement, and say that the acknowledge that a lot of our understanding about this now, and how much it was informed by the founding fathers, so to speak, taking from the Iroquois Confederacy. I think along those lines, it's also sort of fair to ask, what went wrong? Like when you look at the Constitution, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, there's a lot in there that, looked at in the context of today, you can say you really didn't go well in the beginning. And to some extent, I would say that part of that was a failure to recognize how steeped the culture and the people's attitudes were at that time in white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, colonialism, and how contradictory those sort of underlying beliefs, attitudes, cultures were to the values and ideals that those documents were expressing. And so again, this kind of gets back to, like, why is it sort of useful to think about the whole country or other kind of groups as intentional communities? I think it points out how even in intentional communities, despite our best intentions, if we're not aware of everything that's influencing us individually, interpersonally, culturally, systemically, and actively do work to address how those things impact the choices we're making, the design choices for our communities, and be able to do things differently, we're just going to unwittingly recreate the same kind of culture and circumstances we come from. In other words, it takes being intentional. I think it's also interesting to think about what the founding fathers laid down for the country, and how it set it on a particular course without necessarily realizing it. They didn't necessarily actually ever intend for "we the people" to actually mean everyone. But it's almost as if they set a spell down without even realizing what they were doing, which then set the stage for the abolition of slavery, for women's suffrage, for the civil rights movement, for LGBTQ plus rights. So, with our intentional communities, we can run into the same sort of thing. We lay down a certain set of ideas, values, principles, goals, whatever, in foundational documents at the beginning or in the formation. But in the abstract, in the conceptual, it's hard to know the implications of all of that. And certainly in the creation of an intentional community, it's definitely a place where the devil is in the details. And we might think we're on the same page, but then end up having very different ideas about how things should play out, which we might not realize until we actually run into a particular situation or a choice point that might illuminate more subtle differences in values or priorities that we might hold. The question then becomes, in the context of cooperative governance, how do we deal with that? Does it break us? Do we decide that we need to separate? Do we find a compromise and evolve? And so I would say that these are some of the central questions of what governance is all about. So in terms of the purpose of governance, another thing that I want to bring forward here is this piece from the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. So here's what they say about the purpose of governance. It is useful to think of governance as being about how people choose to collectively organize themselves to manage their own affairs, share power and responsibilities, decide for themselves what kind of society they want for their future, and implement those decisions. To do that, they need to have processes, structures, traditions, and rules in place so they can determine who a member of their group is, who is a member of their group, decide who has power and over what, ensure that power is exercised properly, make and enforce their decisions, hold their decision makers accountable, negotiate with others regarding their rights and interests, and establish the most effective and legitimate arrangements for getting those things done. Governance gives a nation, group, community, or organization the ways and means to achieve the things that matter to them. So to really, finally kind of drive the point home about the importance of governance, there's a great video of American Indian activist Russell Means, who's a co-founder of the American Indian movement, speaking in front of the U.S. Senate in 1989. And he talks about how the different points at which 1800s and into the 1900s, native lands were taken away and in different stages, and how in each sort of wave of dispossession that happened, Native people still managed to adapt to regain a degree of self-sufficiency, economic viability. But he says that when the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was signed by President Roosevelt, it institutionalized the tribal governments, which are not one of our institutions and is still foreign to us this very day. We have yet to recover. Definitely recommend checking out that video. Again, the link will be in the notes that you'll get after this. So foundations for cooperative government. So I would say that there is, a fundamental shift in worldview involved with cooperative governance, what I'm calling cooperative governance. Sort of beneath the nuts and bolts, all of the different kinds of systems and structures that we might create to facilitate cooperative governance. To some degree, I would say the foundation is much more on culture and relationships. That said, I would say, if you're looking at kind of what makes up cooperative organizations, you have the systems and structures, you have the culture and relationships, and you have sort of, to some extent, underlying that, or the context for it being the purpose and the vision. And I think, when looking at cooperative governance, these are all things that need to be synergistic. They need to be all sort of based on similar values and really looked at as how are they supporting each other or not. And again, to some extent, I would say that the culture and relationship side of things is more important because the best system won't work if the culture doesn't support it. And fundamentally, it's all about relationships because in cooperative governments, you really can't make anyone do anything. So I want to share a few things that I think are good articulations of this worldview. These are the kinds of things that are more about the underlying principles that you base everything else on. So there's a really great sci-fi series by Becky Chambers, and one of the books in that series is basically an inside look at the life of a space commune. And in this space commune, whenever a baby is born, they're sort of entered into the archives in a ritualistic way, and this is read out. They are now and always a member of our fleet. By our laws, they are assured shelter and passage here. If we have food, they will eat. If we have air, they will breathe. If we have fuel, they will fly. They are child to all grown, sibling to all still growing. We will care for them, protect them, guide them. We welcome them to the decks of this ship. and to the journey we take together. So now this isn't necessarily this isn't a description of a governance system, but you can see in it there is a purpose here, and there's sort of particular things that it is saying need to happen or need to be available, and this can be the basis for a governance system, which would then be designed around being in the service of that purpose. I also want to share this. I love sharing this. It's the Just Transition Framework developed by Movement Generation and the Climate Justice Alliance. To some extent, it is more oriented toward economics, but obviously economics and governance have a very strong tie-in. If you're interested in the economic side of intentional communities, economic models for intentional community, I did a whole workshop last year on economic models, similarly getting into some of this sort of reconceptualization of economics. So great sort of complementary to this. But I think in this framework, you can see the particular places where governance is included, both in terms of how it's viewed in the extractive economy, more as a form of militarism, as opposed to in a living economy based on deep democracy. You also see in the center there the way that governance can be organized on different scales, and then below that the values filter that everything is sort of would be run through. So again, kind of outlining these aspects of what sort of underlies a governance system. I also love sharing this. Is this Black Space Manifesto? Just lots of great ideas here about how to sort of establish the culture of a space, and again, looking at this, it doesn't describe how a governance system would work, but it describes the kinds of principles that a governance system would be in service to. I was also got a chance to be on a webinar, be a participant or spectator of a webinar recently with a panel of Native folks. And they were talking again a little bit more about economics, but also stuff around governance. And at some point, somebody shared the idea that they said, as Native peoples, when we start a conversation about what we do, we start with our values. And they then kind of went into sharing about different aspects of what are the kinds of values or principles. So don't take from the first two bushes, only take what you need and only take what is given. Our job as humans is to be thankful, respect and love, relationships and responsibility, intergenerational. No one is a bystander. All are cared for. Awe for nature. So these are the sort of the kind of intrinsic values, principles that not only the systems are based on, but the culture that supports that system. So again, there's none of this is a governance system, but it's the kind of values and principles that it is important to be clear about and that underlie a cooperative governance system. And I would say that, the other thing about a lot of this sort of stuff is that it can be very useful to write it all down. And that is a pretty common thing. That is sort of what we tend to do. We write down in bylaws and operating agreements and in different kinds of documents, a lot of this sort of stuff, vision and mission statements. But again, I think one of the things that I really want to try and get across is that it has to exist in the culture and in the relationships. It has to exist fundamentally in the mindsets and the worldviews of the individuals involved. It has to be where everyone is coming from, or at least striving to come from. The best system will be undermined by the absence of a supportive culture and a lack of willingness to engage in both the systems and the culture according to the stated values. I'm going to go over a couple more things and then we'll pause for questions. I want to say a little bit about sort of the idea of the spirit of consensus. So for those of you who've been around intentional communities or other kind of cooperative groups that operate by consensus, this idea of the spirit of consensus is something that can come up sometimes. And I want to touch on this a couple of reasons. One is that consensus is important. Consensus as an idea is important to the governance and decision making of a lot of groups. And I know a lot of people have bad experiences and negative associations with consensus. And I'll touch a little bit more on that later. Um, there are a lot of different ways that you can think about consensus as a specific decision-making mechanism in terms of governance. But again, one of the classic ways of thinking about it is as a culture or the spirit of consensus. It definitely comes out of Quaker lineages who talk about this idea of sense of the meeting, which is the idea that truth exists both within us and transcends each of us, and that we're making space for the will of God to become clear to us as a group. So again, this gets into this worldview, mindset, way of relating to each other that informs our governance system. Um, Obviously, a way you can say it is being called to get our egos out of the way, to interrupt superior or savior thinking, that I know what's best or that it's up to me. And moving into this idea of having faith that in the collective process of seeking the common good and being in service to our shared purpose, each of us will also be cared for in that. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Um, there's a lot of different things, obviously that consensus. There often comes in this idea of compromise. And I would say that there are positive forms of compromise where people are openly, collaboratively negotiating for a win-win, and there are negative forms of compromise where people are sacrificing themselves, dismissing, ignoring things, and that you could say that what is being compromised is in fact the integrity of the individuals or of the collective. Somebody also recently shared with me an essay they wrote about the philosophy and work of Maxine Greene, who spoke to the idea of really needing to transcend our subjective experience. Again, not in a way that we lose ourselves and ignore the real needs that we have as individuals, but where we bring our different perspectives together and are able to hold that greater perspective together. Uh, and I guess lastly on this, I would just say that cooperative governance, I think really calls each individual to hold their needs, the individual needs of others and the needs of the group as integral. So not as sort of separate things that need to be, negotiated, though obviously sometimes that does have to happen, but can we see them as integral? And so without dismissing my needs, can I hold your needs and the group's needs as my needs, because we're trying to do something together, and if things aren't working for you or aren't working for the group, then they're not working for me either. And if you're also holding that perspective for me and for the group, if we're all playing that game together, then I think that's really where the magic of cooperative governance can happen. Okay, last piece, and then we'll pause for questions. Consent-based governance and decision making. So I want to bring in this idea of consent because, again, it's right there in the UN's Constitution. Governments are instituted among humans, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So, a couple definitions of consent: a voluntary, uncoerced decision made by a sufficiently autonomous person on the basis of adequate information to accept or reject some proposed course of action that would affect them. Also, where we respect that we have no right to take or demand what someone else is not willing to give or to share, and where it is understood and respected that a person is the best judge of their own needs and wants. So, in other words, I would say that governments, be they nation states or intentional communities, only have as much power as we give to them, we abdicate to them, or they take from us through manipulation or force. And at some point, in part because of the kind of negative associations and bad experiences a lot of people have with consensus in different groups, rather than talking about consensus, I started referring to consent-based decision making. And what's interesting is that the legal term for consensus that you would use in bylaws or our operating agreements is that decisions require unanimous consent. So I think this aspect of individual being able to give their consent as an autonomous being for the group to move forward is a crucial aspect of cooperative governance. And there is this whole part of being human, which is that we are individual organisms that are inherently social animals. So being human is to be part of a group as well. And so how do we look at this idea of consent from a group perspective as well? Um, it starts to kind of take on a whole different dimension in the context of collective decision making, when there are a whole range of factors and needs and implications at play beyond, my personal perspective or personal preferences. Um, I'll also say that, there's a lot of controversy around consensus, and there's this sort of interesting polarized dynamic that's arisen in the intentional communities world between consensus and sociocracy, and I'll touch on that a little bit more as well. But again, I would sort of look at all of this more as just being different forms of consent-based decision making. The idea is whatever the particular mechanism, whether it's people putting their thumbs up, doing a no objection round, whatever it is, that in some way everyone is saying yes, everyone has to give their consent for a decision to be approved. And then the question then, of course, is like, how do you get there? And there are lots of different ways of doing that. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just sort of wrap up this particular part here by saying it part of the challenge around all this is that it is so contrary to how most of us were raised, and all of the different institutions in mainstream society that we are trained in, socialized in, and that even though of course we don't think you should be able to make anyone do anything, it turns out that it's actually really hard when you can't make anyone do anything. Um, when it comes down to it, if people don't agree, aren't willing to compromise, are stuck in conflict, are stuck in their individual perspectives, won't engage, it is really hard to know what to do. And again, the best systems won't work if that's what's going on. No system is going to get you out of that. Systems can support. Again, there's this sort of synergistic aspect of systems and culture where a good system can support the kind of culture that's needed to operate that system well. But fundamentally, I think it's important to keep in mind that cooperative governance relies on cooperative culture and relationships, and that it's up to each of us as individuals to keep showing up and keep making the choices necessary to develop that. Okay, I'm going to pause there and maybe go ahead and stop the screen share for a moment and see if there are questions. Kellen, I think I saw your hand up.
I was just earlier, I had missed when you said that you were going to share the slides, and I was just trying to get that answered, but it has
Yes.
help in the chat. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions, comments at this point? Charles.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you're saying here about culture. I mean, we've been in residence here for 4 years, and for 10 years before that, a whole bunch of people did the building. You actually got the place constructed, and they did that with a heavy corporate culture. They're all people who have held down good jobs and they know how to run a corporate structure. How do you get them to shift, to recognize that once you've moved in, it's all damn different? Thanks.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and one that I don't actually have an easy answer for. But I think it's a really good question to kind of keep holding, and I think this comes in with intentional communities in a lot of different ways. That like once a certain pattern is established, actually shifting out of that pattern is tremendously difficult. Actually sort of being able to bring it into awareness enough that people can have a conversation about it and actually start looking for solutions of different ways of doing things. It's tremendously difficult, but that's just the work that there is to do. I mean, to some extent, you know, again, this is a place, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit more, where to me it's, you know, it often, I think a place that we often overlook is the importance of clear purpose. And you know, there is, even if there isn't a clear purpose, or there isn't clarity of purpose, there is still a purpose at play, um, that is being served, and whether or not that's actually what people want is a whole other question. But so I think looking at that sort of like, what is the purpose of the group, and is it being served by what we're doing? But yeah, again, I mean, I'm, you know, I'm saying this all a little bit like it's easy, but it's obviously not. Culture is this thing that it's like, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in, and actually be bringing it conscious, and actually being able to see how our individual behaviors play into it, and make different choices as a group is tremendously challenging. So I'll just say that for the moment. Yeah, Jen.
I saw Barry had a question. Where was the consent-based decision-making quote from?
That's a good question. One I know was one I believe I was unattributed. The other one I'll have to dig up. I'll make sure that that's in the notes that'll get shared with you who that quote is from. Very, I see you still have your hand up. Is there anything else you wanted to ask about that? No. Okay, great. Awesome. Kellen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where you're going from here, but I just want to name, I am really curious about the dimension of, like, you said several times, if the culture doesn't support the system, then a lot falls apart. It just really doesn't, like, it just doesn't grok. And so
Yeah.
I'm really curious if you're going to talk more about, like, cultivating that relationship between the culture and the system, and just more of that, or not.
It's good. Yeah, ish, maybe some. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to kind of touch on a lot, but let's see where it goes, and maybe we can kind of come back to that issue a little bit more. Yeah,
Kind of acknowledging, like, that is a huge piece, but
yeah.
the purpose of today, we're going to assume that gets to come along. Culture will come along with the good design of the system.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, I think, you know, the part of the deal here is that this is a 90-minute session, and there's, you know, trying to get an overview of a lot of different things here. But I'm not sure when you might have come in, but I mentioned at the beginning that there is the possibility that this 90-minute session could be developed into a multi-session course, and so certainly those sorts of things would be part of what we would get
Great.
into a lot more.
I was just going to say, I'll vote for the class version. Yeah, the course version.
Yeah, for sure. Lee.
So I'm hoping this is helpful, because I was thinking about the question that Charles asked. And our communities, we're in Silicon Valley, and most of the people, when we were forming and designing, you know, were in that culture. And
Yeah.
maybe it's a different kind of what you were calling corporate culture, because we're more in, you know, where small groups of people would work collaboratively on a problem, in that, even in the corporate culture there. And so in our building phase, we actually did a huge amount of where there were very small groups of people charged with making decisions or coming up with recommendations for various aspects of the building and design. And we've essentially carried that through now. We're in our 10th year of living together. And what we have teams that each have a charter, and those teams have a fair amount of, so it's kind of a somewhat socio.
Uh-oh. We lost you, Lee.
Theocracy thing.
Oh.
Maybe can you hear me now?
Yeah, I
guess
think you're
not.
back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're continuing to do that, but with a lot of sensitivity that if a team, even though it has authority in something, it makes, it says, oh, we're doing something that's maybe a little bit different. What do you think about this, gang?
Yeah.
And we may not go through a consensus process in the official
Mhm.
sense, but still they expose it and ask for feedback and then make and move forward
Right.
based on that. So we don't do that many consensus decisions in a year, maybe
Mhm.
5 or 6 or 7. But a lot of stuff like that goes on.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, so I'm gonna jump back into it. I think I was looking ahead at my notes. There's a section later on, some notes about warning signs, and there's definitely some stuff there where we can touch a little bit more on the culture side of things. The next chunk of stuff is a little bit more kind of practical and getting into some nuts and bolts sort of stuff. So kind of again, we'll overview and kind of get a mix of stuff going here. All right, so let me start my screen share again. Okay, so practicing cooperative governance. So the first thing I want to do here is kind of make a distinction between governance and decision making. So kind of on more of a practical level, what do I mean when I say governance? So to some extent, this is semantics, and I'm just sort of laying this out in this diagram in a way, and so it's all a little arbitrary, and but this is just one way of thinking about it. So one way to think about decision making in particular is the particular mechanism by which a group makes a decision. So again, informal consensus, it might look like putting their people's thumbs up or to the side or down to indicate a block. Stand asides, agreement, that sort of thing. And again, in sociocracy, there's a no objection round when a proposal is being considered. Obviously, voting is another particular decision-making mechanism. Then there's the process by which a group gets to the point of decision making. So, and this generally looks like different ways that an issue is brought to a group for consideration. This is kind of what Lee was just sort of pointing at. How is input gathered, and what might be the iterative process of developing a proposal that the group will ultimately put to the test using whatever decision making mechanism it uses. And then the process and the organization as a whole utilizes particular structures. So in terms of process, that might include meetings, which might be different ways that meetings might be run, different purposes. They might be sort of a more explicitly meetings for discussion and input as opposed to actual decision making. The different roles that are often involved in running meetings, how agendas are set, who might attend the different meetings. You have other process structures or tools like surveys, interviews, or informal conversations with different stakeholders. And then usually there's a whole sort of, there are often written proposals that might go through multiple drafts. Then there are the organizational structures of teams, committees, managers, board of directors, other kinds of subgroups that are delegated certain decision-making authority by the group. And then, of course, the bylaws, operating agreements, and other kind of policies that might define how all of those things operate. You've also got other, there existing written agreements, aka policy, that either a proposal has to conform to, or that may define existing standard processes by which certain decisions are made. So, again, I'm just sort of throwing a whole bunch of stuff out here, but like all of that kind of together, that whole amalgamation of agreement structures, process, decision making within the context of the culture and relationships of the group, and within the context of the particular purpose and vision of the group, is what I would call a governance system. So now, obviously, the scope and complexity of a governance system is going to be different depending on the size of the group, the scope and complexity of its activity, as well as the culture and the personalities of the people involved. And so I think particularly, the where governance and decision making can sort of become a little bit more almost synonymous is in smaller groups where there's maybe not a whole lot of different things that that a smaller group is doing. There's less that it actually has to decide, or less that it's actually managing together. And so, in smaller groups, sometimes it is feasible to just make all decisions together at a weekly meeting. And so in that case, there is much more of an overlap between what you might call governance and what you might call just decision making. But again, I think this is a place where, really looking at matching the complexity of your governance system again to the complexity of the group and what the group is doing is really important. I am generally a big fan of form following function as opposed to the other way around. So I wanted to say a little bit more about consensus and sociocracy, in part to kind of help illustrate this distinction I'm talking about between governance and decision making. As far as consensus goes, there's a couple things that I think are important to keep in mind. One is that there is no consensus on what consensus is or how it is done. You can also think of consensus as primarily being a philosophy along the lines of the spirit of consensus I talked about. And of course, there are going to be a million different takes on what that is. Various people have developed consensus as a model for decision-making process, often referred to as formal consensus. And there are lots of different, flow charts and models and different variations out there for how consensus can be done, different forms of modified consensus. Again, when people talk about modified consensus, often what they're referring to is the particular decision-making mechanism of consensus, where everyone has to give explicit agreement. And again, lots of different ways to do that. Some of the classic variations on consensus are consensus -1 or consensus -2, which is basically more than one or more than two people have to block a decision in order for it to not pass. Or there's also this idea of 5-finger consensus, where people hold up different numbers of fingers depending on the level of support, and you kind of count up, how what the total number is, and there's certain thresholds for whether something is reconsidered or passes or not. So one of the places I would say, thinking about governance, where I think people get tripped up with consensus is that I think there is often an assumption that consensus means that everyone has to make all decisions all together all the time, which is not how it needs to be, and ignores all the possibilities for how to use structure and process to help make things more efficient. If everyone is still primarily coming from their individual perspectives, and seeing consensus as trying to find the lowest common denominator of compromise, it's not likely to go well. And if that is happening sort of where it's like we all have to come together to make all decisions together, again, it's sort of a setup for things being inefficient and frustrating. Again, size of the group matters, scope of and complexity of the group matters in terms of what's it doing, what actually makes sense here. I think another place that consensus, where there's sort of a lack of attention in consensus, is that there's a tendency to assume that the default is the status quo if a group can't agree on a change. So said another way, if somebody proposes a change to things and it doesn't pass, the assumption is that things just stay the way they are. But even if that isn't actually working for various people in the group or the group as a whole. And so, I think there's an interesting thing that I honestly have not actually seen very much of, but I think a way that you can practice consensus is by saying, if somebody says, hey, this isn't working, I want to propose a change, you don't just default to status quo if you can't agree on a change, but it is possible that you allow for calling an existing decision into question, and such that the group has to come up with something new, that they have to pass something new. Now, obviously, there's also the possibility in different kinds of cooperative decision-making models of if you leave too much open to question, if you leave too much open to the possibility of change, this can create a level of instability or result in process fatigue. But I think there's, I think that the challenge there is to find sort of what is the middle ground of adaptability, flexibility, openness to change, while still kind of helping make sure that you're able to keep operating in the way that you need to operating and get things done the way you need to get them done. So I guess in general, I would say that, when there are problems in consensus on the system side of things, there's usually a failure to get creative and sophisticated about the structures and process, or there's a tendency to be too rigid about them. And then there's usually also an aspect of culture and relationship that needs to be addressed, which no change to the system is going to help. And I would say often, again, we'll touch on this a little bit more. Often that has to do with how we relate to conflict, and our willingness to sort of openly and directly communicate with each other. Okay, so how does this relate to sociocracy? So if you have any familiarity with sociocracy, or kind of vaguely or kind of interested in it, what I would say about sociocracy is that it is a full-blown governance system. It's got its circle structure and how that works with the different roles. It's got specific ways that proposals are developed. It has specific ways that meetings are conducted. It has specific ways for evaluating proposals that are approved and implemented. There's a whole election process for people taking on certain roles. And then it has its various guiding principles, like the often quote, everyone's favorite, good enough for now, safe enough to try. So I think part of the appeal of sociocracy is that it is a whole package where all these things are already worked out. Whereas even in the more developed formal consensus models, they tend to leave you a little bit still more on your own to sort of figure out the details for yourself, focusing more on guidelines. So I think that, so obviously there's just sort of pros and cons there. I think the potential downside of sociocracy is that it is very complicated, which works well for some groups, but not necessarily for others. It also takes a long time to learn and implement properly, which most groups just don't really have the capacity for, and often sort of implement it in a piecemeal sort of way, which ends up kind of creating confusion, and they end up just kind of adapting their own process in the end anyways. But I think all of this stuff is good stuff to learn, take different trainings, get familiar with different things. Yeah, no, that's all I'll say about that. Again, I just want to sort of touch on this idea of centering purpose. So I think the more clarity of purpose you have, the more that can inform all of the different aspects of what you're doing, and it's good to be clear about whatever it is. Now, obviously, like for me, I'm an advocate for having a sense of purpose that is bigger than your community, that is really trying to offer something to the world. But for many communities, simply like having a community where we're good neighbors with each other is the purpose. If that's the purpose, cool, be clear about that, because often the conflict comes in where it sort of establishes like, yeah, we want to be a good community of good neighbors, and helping each other out. And it's just kind of basic that way. But if some people have sort of maybe an even unconscious sort of assumption or desire that we're actually going to be leaning in more, there's going to be more community there, we're going to be sharing a lot more, like whatever, we're going to be more sort of intimate and vulnerable with each other, and other people are like not on that same page. If that isn't clear, if it's not clear what the actual sort of shared purpose is, then it just sort of leaves open that room for conflict. That especially if it's not sort of clear what the nature of the conflict is. There's just sort of the basic question of why are we doing this? Part of it too is that if it's not clear, people will default towards their personal preferences and their individual needs. And it becomes a guide for not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it, how we relate to each other, what our strategies are. I would also say that purpose can be a really important driver for membership process. So particularly for when you're screening for new members or integrating new members, it can help provide a guide for like, what kind of members are you looking for? Are you attracting members who are really on board with trying to fulfill that purpose and integrating them in a way that that helps them do that? I would also say that there's a very clear tie-in with purpose, governance, membership, and economics. Again, economics being more than just about money, but how do we get our needs met, and how are we creating the capacity to actually accomplish these things that we say that we want to do, which obviously to some extent requires us being clear about what it is that we're saying that we want to do. All right, so I'm going to run through a bunch more stuff. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. I want to leave some time for a few more questions or comments. I think that there's a bunch of kind of key values and design principles. And again, I've got a bunch of notes here that you'll get a link to. So there's more that will come. But I think, there's a lot, to kind of bring into this idea of accessibility in particular, which is a very important value that people identify a lot in intentional community and progressive organizations of all kinds. What does that mean? Like, what does accessibility look like? And I would say that to a large degree, accessibility when it comes to cooperative governance looks like clarity. Is it clear how things are operating, what the system is? Is there transparency in terms of communications, reports? Like, do people know what's going on and not having things behind the scenes? And accountability. Are the people who are in decision-making roles, are they accountable to people to the rest of the group? And then I would say kind of within that framework, adaptability is also super key, like being able to actually go through reevaluation processes and be able to change things is very, very important to accessibility in terms of, if the more you want people to be able to come in, the more you want to be able to accommodate the different needs of new people coming in. I want to note in here, a lot of I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with using hierarchy or delegation of decision-making power to groups or people within cooperative organizations, often especially on the operations side of things, that can be really important. I think if you're going to use those sorts of things, particularly, forms of hierarchy, I think the key places to be clear are who is responsible for making what decisions, what is the path to becoming part of any particular decision-making body, how does decision-making process work, and particularly how do people give input, and how do they address issues even if they're not necessarily part of the decision-making body that would ultimately make a decision about it? Overall, do people in the group, regardless of whatever the structure is, do people feel like they have an avenue to be heard, to be considered, and to feel empowered and engaging in that system? Obviously, discussing and addressing power dynamics openly and collaboratively is super important. And I would say, again, culture and relationships, and so fundamental to all of this is developing trust. Developing trust is key, and fostering safe space for people to be vulnerable about who they are and what they want is key to that. In terms of the other piece here, commitment and responsibility, I think there's a key piece here that I come back to a lot, which is about our relationship to institutions. So mostly we are all raised in mainstream institutions where we are not heard, considered, or empowered, and that we are either sort of given undue power over, or we are or power is taken from us and we are subjected to it. And kind of all of this is traumatic in its own different ways to different people. So whether or not you assume power, whether you assume that you are going to be disempowered, whether you assume that you just need to kind of navigate or manipulate systems to try and get your needs met, all these sorts of things, we bring all of that into our communities. And so being aware of our relationship to institutions and how we bring that into our communities in ways that might not actually be helpful or appropriate, I think is a really key place to look. And again, this sort of really has to do with these aspects of commitment and responsibility that are so core to this. And I think fundamentally in a cooperative governance system, and especially in an intentional community where there is so much at stake in terms of land and homes and different things that are going on, I heard Adrienne Marie Brown quoting Grace Lee Boggs saying, if you want to change something, you have to be responsible for it. And I would say that there's also a thing in intentional community where there's, often a tension between long-term people and newer people. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to not acknowledging the different needs involved and sort of recognizing the different legitimate needs involved. And not making space in some cases, or not recognizing again, what's at stake for people in other cases. So, I'm speaking a little generally here, but I think to some respect, if you're living in an intentional community, to some extent, acting as if you're gonna live there for the rest of your life, even if you probably aren't, can be a really helpful way to go about it. And then if you are probably going to live there for the rest of your life, recognizing that the community is going to outlive you and things need to be able to evolve. Trying to see what else do I want to say about this here. I think another key aspect of commitment and responsibility in cooperative governance is to some degree, everyone should have an understanding of everything that's going on in the community, and not just leaving things to others, particularly when it comes to governance and also finances. Again, this sort of idea of transparency and clarity in systems. I think governance and finances in particular are really, really key places to, even though people hate spreadsheets, people, whatever, there's so much baggage around money, so much baggage around governance, but actually, taking the time to make sure people are really on the same page about how those systems work and that it's really transparent and accessible is super key to cooperative governance. Lots of other things that I could say here, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move along a little bit. I mean, again, I think our enculturation in mainstream society around individualism, privacy, entitlement, privilege, these are all really important things to have conversations about in cooperative governance. And again, they affect all of us. No one is immune from being impacted by these different things. It lives in all of us in different ways. So being able to have open conversations about that is very important. And in general, I think in a lot of these sort of thinking about key values, I think an attitude of service and a level of good-natured flexibility are really key qualities to bring in. And I'll also just throw in here that I think the importance of trainings, and then again, the sort of the orientation of new people coming in, but also the ongoing training and ongoing refreshers for people who have been in a community for a long time, I think can't be underestimated.
Hey, Sky.
Yo.
Before you move on, Kellen had a good question about some points you made a few minutes ago. Would you be willing to go back to that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kellen.
Hey, Sky. Sorry. Thanks. This is also great. I just, there are some of the points that you're making that are sort of like a series, like listing a series of things. There was some stuff about decision making. And I really value that you're packing in a lot of information, but I'm also not able to even keep up with my notes. And so I'm just wondering if I was wondering if at the time if you could just restate that particular series, but I guess I just wonder if some of those like tangible things, like a list of questions that are important to ask, might be put in text or a visual form later because you don't have a slide for them right now.
Yeah, you're going to get an email that has the recording for this as well as the slides, and then a link to a notes to a doc that has all the notes on this. So
All the notes, meaning what?
like a lot of the detail of what I'm saying will be in the notes document that
Oh,
you'll
okay.
get a link to.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Before, after. This does feel like an last little piece in here that I want to note that I think is important is that I think there's a key tie-in in terms of governance, cooperative governance and ownership model for intentional communities. Sometimes, not always, there is an assumption that investment, financial investment is tied to ownership, and that ownership is tied to decision making. Those things do not necessarily need to be true. Obviously, it depends to some extent on your ownership model, like particularly in co-housing communities where you have a homeowners association and people own their own homes. That is sort of just the way it is. But there are still ways that you can kind of build systems around that. You don't actually have to give that more importance than it needs to have legally. And so, there are communities out there that I know who have, created kind of interesting systems that incorporate, people other than people who just happen to own a home in the community, in creative ways. And where the basis of decision making is more around things like the responsibility and commitment people are taking, or different agreements around membership. And that those things are accessible to people regardless of the level of financial investment that they may have in the community. Okay, so I'm going to run through a little bit of kind of nuts and bolts stuff. Again, you're going to get the recording, you're going to get notes, you're going to get slides. So bear with me. Just kind of let this kind of wash over you, and hope get the gist of it. So foundational documents and statements. We're talking about like a couple different levels of things here. Most groups, like particularly if you're going to own property, we're talking about legal documents for legal entities, things that a court of law might look at if things go really badly and you end up in court over something. But these legal documents, again, bylaws, operating agreements, they're going to define basic things like who makes decisions, how you become part of the decision-making body, what the basic mechanism by which decisions are made is. And then obviously if it applies things like ownership stakes, dissolution of the entity and any assets, that sort of thing. There might also be in that or separate identity defining foundational documents. Again, things like vision statements, mission statements, lists of principles, covenants, these sorts of things. I think all of these things are important. The one of the big cautions that I usually have around this sort of around foundational documents and statements is they're only as meaningful as the process that created them. In other words, if it is just a bunch of nice words on a piece of paper that most people in the community don't actually have any familiarity with and aren't related to in some fundamental way, like they're not going to be that useful. They're just going to sit on a in a Google Drive folder or a literal filing cabinet somewhere or whatever, and just not necessarily actually be applied. And I think there is an importance in revisiting these kinds of statements and documents on a semi-regular basis. Somebody made the analogy of renewing your vows in a marriage. So what does it look like for an intentional community to every 5-10 years to renew its vows to each other? So how do we keep these kind of basic fundamental premises about what we're doing and why we're doing it? How do we keep them alive and actually keep these kinds of statements useful? In terms of written agreements, again, aka policy, as well as process, again, lots to say here. I would say that a key aspect of both policy and process is around the complexity of it. There's often a tendency to either have things be more complicated than they need to be, or to actually be less complicated than they need to be. Obviously it kind of depends on the complexity of the issue, but generally speaking, I'm a big fan when it comes to process of sort of having a sense of like, what are the tools that you have at your disposal, the different kinds of meetings, surveys, that sort of thing that you use. What are your process tools? Clarity around who makes what decisions, and then a certain degree of sort of flexibility in terms of how you approach any particular situation that comes up. Now, there are also a lot of cases where you might have policy that defines certain things about certain things how they need to go. And in some cases, it is useful to really delineate out, like, here's what you do in this scenario, here's what you do in this scenario, and have certain processes defined for how to address, particular kinds of situations. Even if it makes sense to get into those more kind of deeper levels of detail, having written in there what the basis and guidelines for making exceptions are, because you will never be able to write a policy that will cover every situation that will come up. And there is a degree there to which I am often more of a fan of setting out guidelines and principles, as opposed to like getting more kind of legalistic about like if every situation that might come. In terms of process, again, this is where things like, the art of facilitation comes in. How do you design good meetings? Which often has a lot to do with the purpose or goals of the meetings. So again, just kind of really thinking through what are the different kinds of tools you have available and how do you apply it to the different situations that come up. With process also, obviously, you have the different kind of dynamics at play. There again, there might be a certain degree of clarity around who makes what kinds of decisions and the process by which that is made. But sometimes there are people who really care about an issue that you should be checking in with when you're developing a proposal, even if they're not actually part of the decision-making body, but like they know enough, they care enough, they potentially are going to be obstructive if they are not checked in with. So just kind of knowing those kinds of dynamics and attending to those different kinds of relationships and issues. Is there existing conflict between two people, especially that the two people that are going to be involved in an issue, even if the conflict has nothing to do with what the actual proposal is, but those two people are likely to just kind of go at it because they've got a thing with each other. Those sorts of things, how do we attend to them? Management structures and roles, again, boards, teams, committees, circles, managers, coordinators, directors, etc. I think all of those things can be super useful. Again, just clarity on who's doing what, so people know where to go, and where things are, whether or not things are going to fall through the cracks. I think are very useful. This is kind of a place where I'm definitely a big fan of organizational charts. I think organizational charts, that are kept updated can be super useful. I also think process guides that kind of accompany organizational charts, again, to help people navigate processes, especially in more complex systems, can be really, really helpful. In terms of decision making, the sort of the key pieces here that I just want to sort of, again, sort of flag is like, I think are important is when there is a lack of consent. So in sociocracy, if somebody does object, or in consensus, if somebody does block, I think there is sort of a tendency to sort of think of that as the end of the process. And to some extent, like, that's just the beginning. Like, obviously there's something at play there that needs a whole additional things. So really kind of having a clear idea of like, what do you do in the when somebody is not willing to give their consent to something is a key part of decision making. And then I would say that the implementation of decisions and the reevaluation of decisions are often very overlooked and important things to build into how you approach things. Communication systems and skills, I think there is a tendency, particularly in kind of cultures we tend to come from, to rely too much on written communication. And again, this kind of gets to the cultural sort of stuff around the importance of face-to-face communication, open, direct communication. There's also some equity and accessibility concerns around focusing too much on written communication in terms of it favoring certain people who have certain education or time available. I'm not saying don't use written communication, especially at this point, things like Slack or other kinds of platforms to facilitate kind of basic communication are super useful. But it just not getting sort of stuck in the trap of leaning too much into written communication, especially when it comes to when there's conflict or high emotions at play. And again, this is a place, a lot of these sorts of things could be their own whole sessions. So I'm just kind of note that for now. And then, obviously related to the communication stuff, conflict resolution, social hygiene, but basically, what are the practices that you have in play for airing tensions, for addressing issues before they become conflicts or after they become conflicts? And again, I think, we live in a very conflict avoidant society. So a lot of this stuff, especially doing it in a more proactive way, can be really scary. But think of it like brushing your teeth. It's better to brush your teeth every day than to end up having a root canal or lose a tooth. So, and again, there's lots of different ways to do this. And that there's no right system, there's no best system. Again, with a lot of this sort of stuff, I over the years, I am often asked, what's the best governance system? What's the best membership system? What's the best conflict resolution system? And on some level, I think the answer really is it's the one that the group is on board with. Are you on the same page about the kind of community you want, what your values are, how you want to put that into practice? And are you all willing to engage in something? Because again, you can't make anyone do anything. And so it really does come down to you can't legislate culture. People have to be willing to show up. And if you have if there's problems then around it, you have to be willing to have open conversations about it, and maybe even sometimes insist that the group has conversations about it. All right. Again, kind of keeping track of time here. So I want to say a little bit about warning signs. Again, this is kind of getting into the cultural sort of aspects of things, but there's a lot of different things that you sort of, I'm sure we've all seen in different ways. Camps or factions forming, lobbying or strong arming, entrenched unresolved conflicts, things that aren't being said publicly but behind the scenes, disagreement being treated as an attack. Some people being more familiar with process or policy than others in using process to push or stop proposals. People being unwilling to hear feedback or be held accountable, particularly those in positions of power. Scapegoating or villainizing. Yeah, I think those last two are interesting and connected. Ideally, if someone is misusing their power and needs to be held accountable, it generally doesn't work to villainize them. And I think one of the things that we are learning is how to have accountability with compassion. How to be able to bring everyone in if that is possible. And I think with a lot of this stuff, and again, kind of the cultural sort of stuff that people run into, so sometimes the hardest step is in simply addressing these kinds of dynamics, actually like being able to bring it up in a way that other people can see, can recognize, and that you can actually be able to have a conversation about. Yeah. Trying to think if there's anything more to say around all of this stuff. I think partly in the interest of time, I think I'm going to leave it there for now. So I'm just going to say last couple kind of wrapping up things, and then we'll still have a few more minutes for some final questions. So this quote from an amazing elder in the cooperative movement named Ed Whitfield: "Starting a cooperative isn't rocket science; it's harder." And the way that I've been saying this a lot lately is community is hard, and that's the point. We're trying to do something different than what is happening in mainstream society. We're trying to do something different than all of our training and socialization from mainstream society. We don't magically know how to operate in a cooperative governance system simply by stepping into it. We're going to bring all of that baggage in. There's going to be a lot of learning and unlearning that has to happen, both in terms of how systems operate and the culture, the way that culture lives in and through us. So it's gonna be hard. There's just no way around it. But that's the point, that we have an opportunity to do something different, to actually bring these different aspects conscious, to be able to actually have collective conversations about them, and to try to then make different choices that we can all live out together in a way that creates a different kind of experience. So it's hard, and that's the point, because that's the opportunity. And I think that, rather than just sort of looking at intentional communities as being nice places to live, we need to take this on as a practice, that these things are hard, but the whole point is that we're trying to figure out different ways of doing things, not just for ourselves and the communities we live in, but for the whole world, because the world needs this. All right, so I'm going to stop my screen share, and we got 10 minutes before the official end of the session. I just want to see, any questions, comments at the end here before we wrap up. Yeah, Charles.
I thought one of the most interesting words you just used was unlearning.
Mm-hmm.
And I would really appreciate, or I've got to find, is some examples of how communities have helped their members, particularly the powerful ones, to unlearn what they learned in operations. But that's just a comment. I really like
Yeah.
it. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and I'll add to that too. Somebody, I have mixed feelings, even as someone who struggles with addiction, on 12-step programs. But somebody, had pointed out last summer at a gathering that there really is something in recovery processes. There's aspects that really are applicable to this sort of stuff, in terms of, like, we're all in recovery from mainstream society, and I think particularly in terms of, like, you know, acknowledging that we have a problem, and looking to others to help us understand the impacts of our behavior, as well as being in service to something greater than ourselves. Like, these are some key aspects of kind of addiction recovery processes that I think are very applicable to the kind of to intentional community, or the kind of cooperative cultures and governance and everything that we're trying to create. Anything? Any last comments, questions? I know I threw a lot at you. It's again, 90 minutes. It's a long time, but it's not a lot of time. But you're going to get the recording. You're going to get notes and slides, so you'll be able to, you'll have a chance to review it on your own time if you want. Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Nobody else wants to ask a question either. What's the best
Sure.
thing you've done on governance? Recommend me a book.
For what?
For governance in intentional communities, and anything that that your go-to sources, or
I mean, I think really, I mean, again, would in part because of what I'm saying around the importance of culture. I think what I'd actually more recommend is there is a book, the Cooperative Culture Handbook, that was written by Mayana Ludwig and Karen Gimnig. Mayana's been a long-term FIC person. Karen's been a long-term co-housing person, and they thank you for putting that up on the screen there. There it is, the Cooperative Culture Handbook. A lot of really good practical stuff there, and I think that sort of get back to this question around how do you cultivate the kind of culture that's going to best support the kinds of systems. I mean, otherwise I would say, just look out there for, you know what, there's some old school stuff. I don't know if it's still carried through the FIC, but we used to carry there was the manual for group facilitators and building united judgment. Those are some like old school titles that are definitely, I think, oldies but goodies. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah, thanks, Jen, for putting those links in the chat. Lee.
Yeah, I would like to put in a very strong plug for the Cooperative Culture Handbook. It is very uniquely organized in little chunks that are really punchy, and as Sky Blue said, are very usable. And it just is an incredible resource.
Well, I think maybe this is a good place to wrap up. I'm gonna one more time put my my website and my email in the chat. It'll be in materials, so you'll get as well. Kellen.
All right, it's not a very big question. I'm totally just digesting everything. But just I did scan back through, and I've seen mention of Grace Lee Boggs a couple times.
Yeah.
And can you just sort of position them and who does she? What's her functional role in the ecosystem?
Grace Lee Boggs, and I'm forgetting her husband's name, but they were important. They were in Detroit, I think, primarily. Just very active community organizers in through the 1900s, through most of the last century. Yeah, I don't know. There's lots that could be said, but very very key community organizer figures for a long time.
You said Grace Lee Boggs and someone else. Are you saying?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what her husband's name is. They're both let's see, James Boggs.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone so much. Again, I mean, I saw a few votes for a longer course on this, so appreciate that. I mean, again, I'm happy to let me or FIC folks know if a longer course on all of this is something you'd be interested in. And otherwise, thank you, and feel free to be in touch. Jen, anything last things from you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Sky. That was quite a fire hose of information for everybody. I just see all the faces like slowly charting all that information. I think a course would be great for that. Thank you everybody else for joining us today. You will receive a link in the recording for the recording later today. So keep an eye on your inbox or your spam folder, depending on how well that works. And then I'm going to put, I did not have it, hang on. I have a link for you. If you wouldn't mind doing an evaluation for this session, you might be able to add in the notes in there if you are interested in having it be a course. And then Lauren will read over all of those and can coordinate with Sky and figure that out. Otherwise, thank you again, Sky. That was wonderful to have you, and everybody else have a great day, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Sky.